One of my favorite programs ever was Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. And my favorite thing about it wasn't any of the material, but it was the premise. And that was that it was so obvious that when I think Acura was the first sponsor, they had agreed to pay for something before knowing what it was. And that's because nobody would have ever financed a show where Jerry Seinfeld goes out and goes to get coffee with someone he already knows, borrowing somebody else's very nice car, and they just complain about being famous. But that's exactly what the show is. And the idea of getting to a place where somebody will pay you to produce something that's exactly what you want it to be is the holy grail of producing any kind of a video, right? And so when we got to the point where Auto Tempest was open to a new show concept, but we really got to kind of do whatever we wanted, obviously the answer is we want to play Top Gear. And if we all watch the show, we all love the content. And so we did several of these shows, and it came time to do what became the 7th show. And we'd done premises of cheap supercars and unreliable cars and most appreciated cars and cheap Ferraris and all these things and had an absolute blast. But I wanted to do something a little bit different that was also a little different than what Auto Tempest does. So we love Auto Tempest because it compiles all the major listing sites into a single place. You can search on Auto Trader or Cars.com or Car Gurus, all these different sites at the same time and see all the results in one place. So we love it. But I wanted to do a series where we would import a car. In the United States, when a car is 25 years or more older, the same way for 15 years in Canada, you can really bring in anything you want. It's the way a lot of old Defenders have come in and Skylines and stuff like that. But whenever a car turns 25 years old, all bets are off. No federalization, no show or display, no special provisions. You just get to own and drive it with a title. And so I thought that was a terrific premise for Car Trek. And so we kind of wrote into the series that I got to pick, and that is what I selected. And one of the main reasons that I wanted to pick and I wanted to do that was because the TVR Cerbera had turned 25 years old. So we were going to shoot this either in 2021 or early in 2022, and 1996 was the first model year of the Cerbera. Now, we never got that Peter Wheeler era of TVR cars here in the US. They'd kind of ended in the terrible 80s, and so the 90s super cool cars that we'd fallen in love with playing video games and obviously watching Swordfish, the amazing stunts, and John Travolta having 2 machine guns shooting out of the top of this Tuscan, along with Halle Berry's absolutely amazing acting skills that was in the movie. It was just an unbelievable and unforgettable experience that, along with the Top Gear things and everything else that we had seen about TVRs, made me dream of owning one. So this was going to be my first opportunity, and I wanted to express my love for that opportunity through a Top Gear premise. And so I told Freddie and Tyler about this. They thought it was a great idea, and we even got Auto Tempest to agree to let us be challenged by them to buy cars that we couldn't find on their website. And so it felt like a win-win-win. And we still got to tell people why you should actually just find a car on Auto Tempest and not go through the hassles, because spoiler alert, it took me $13,000 in shipping costs to get this TVR here. But I called my friend Sam Hard from the UK and I said, hey, I need to find a Cerbera, and I know they've just now started to be old enough, and he learned that there were only like 20 of them, in fact, that were produced early enough to be eligible for US import by when we thought we would need to start shipping it this way. And so I said, look, we'll just start looking, see what you can find. I'd actually talked to some different TVR experts over the years about like the realistic possibility of what it would be like to own one and whether or not they'd be maintainable, whether you could get parts and things like that. And in the UK and in the areas where you could buy a TVR when they were new, they don't have a stellar reputation of reliability and quality. And so it's kind of like a Dodge Viper or something like that here, where there's a lot of allure and there's a lot of brand identity, but they're not necessarily the best cars. And I wanted to experience that for myself. Sam had kind of reminded me that that was going to be the reality, but I said, let's find one. A couple of weeks later, he calls me doing verbal backflips on the phone at the car that he had discovered. And he said, Ed, do you remember the Max Power car? I said, I remember Max Power magazine, but no, none of them really stand out. He said, well, there was one. And this is what all of my childhood dreams are still made of. He said it was featured in a lot of magazines with scantily clad women, including Max Power, and that a lot of people's first pornographic experience was along with this car. I said, well, that's not better than a normal one. He said, no, we have to buy it. And I said, well, is it good? And he said, no, it's not. It's plastic dipped gold. It's not well kept. It does have a lot of service records, but it doesn't really sound like it works. I said, you aren't making me want it more, Sam. And he said, no, we have to buy it. I said, with my money? And that was the answer. And so he ends up negotiating with the seller, buying it pretty cheap. I think at the time it was probably the cheapest Cerbera ever to have sold. I didn't know at that time how much it deserved to be the cheapest one to ever have sold. It turns out an awful lot. It was really bad. So he convinced me that it was going to arrive in perfect shape, but sometimes Sam has been known to exaggerate. The car shows up, gets stuck in the port for a month. I get charged all these fees for it being there. And about, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 weeks after it's been on US soil, the truck arrives. And he tells me, do not let the car stall because we will never get it started again. Obviously, the car doesn't come with an owner's manual or anything like that. He explains to me how he learned to start the car and that you have to put in this little locker key under the dash that you can't see, turn that 90 degrees clockwise. Then you've got to use this, what looks like a little USB stick that's the immobilizer, and stick it into a slot long enough that the red light stops blinking and goes solid. And then you have to select among the many unmarked buttons on the steering wheel and press the one that starts the car. Nothing's labeled. I don't know what I'm doing. Sam didn't offer any tutelage of how this might work. And so I get it started. However, the seat is stuck in the extreme forward position. Now, I had been told that Peter Wheeler was a tall person and that people up to 6'3" could fit comfortably in the car. Whoever told me that was wrong. The car is extremely uncomfortable, and dimensionally, I don't know what like a properly proportioned individual for this TVR would look like, but all right, I'm 6'5", I've got a 35-inch inseam. There's about 18 inches of travel in the throttle pedal. I couldn't floor it. However, the seat was as far back as it would go, so that I could scoot it forward, but as far back as it would go, my knee on the left side was simultaneously contacting the steering wheel, the dash, the center tunnel, and my foot was falling into a hole that was probably supposed to be part of the firewall. So you'd have one short leg, one long leg. There's no adjustment for like the mirror on the other side. So you'd have about 1.5 feet longer left arm in order to do it. There's no mirror to see backwards. So you have a real flexible neck. You're not sitting in the center relative to the steering wheel. I'm used to that with Mercies, but your head would be more on this side of your body. It was a really, really strange car. And that didn't stop. So the seat, fortunately, was stuck in the extreme forward position. So I had to get it home with no adjustment. Fortunately, it was early in the morning, so I made it home without dying. But I'm still learning to drive a right-hand drive car without being in the middle of the road. It doesn't shift well. The clutch was going, so second gear was generally unavailable without a considerable amount of grinding. But we make it home. We had to put part of the exhaust in the passenger seat because it had fallen off during transport. I think it had fallen off a few times, and it continued to do so. Running really, really badly. Just real bad. The gauges don't work, so you don't really know why or how it's running badly. But we get it back to the house, and I kind of get to behold the car for the first time in a peaceful environment. Now, this car was modified in the max power era, and that's what's most significant about the car. It's what was most significant to Sam in his admiration and appreciation for what the car is. Now, Pimp My Ride became a very popular automotive show of the 90s and early 2000s in the United States. And that show, like many successful American shows, was emulated into the UK. We've done that and vice versa as well with like American Idol and stuff like that. But Pimp My Ride went into the UK and it was hosted by Jamie Shaw, who owned Carisma, a shop. There's a license plate from it back there. That was sort of the West Coast customs of the UK version of Pimp My Ride. And this was the ultimate manifestation of their approach to the automobile. So what that means is there were speakers everywhere you could put one. They didn't work, partially because if they did, it would have caught us on fire even worse than we did twice. And so there's speakers everywhere that don't work. There's holes cut in everywhere. At one point, there was a gigantic nitrous bottle sitting in the back right in the center of the two seats that didn't have padding for whatever reason. But it's actually called a 3+1 car, fun fact, because they made the passenger seat too far forward so that a person could sit behind the passenger. So it's 3 uncomfortable occupants plus 1, I don't know what the plan is, but yeah, so whatever. The car was painted from purple to gold, and then at some point later it had been painted this chameleon orange, and somebody had plasti dipped it gold again. And Sam had explained to me the arduous task of unplasti dipping it, as we were really kind of planning to paint it back gold, but then it looked so ridiculously awesome in orange, we decided to keep it orange. But regardless, the body kit that was on the car wasn't of any high quality and did not fit. It was kind of to emulate a Speed 12 Cerberus. There was this wing that was a little bit off, but nobody was worried about the downforce of this car. Everything's falling off, held on by wood screws. It was a real train wreck of a thing. But when you think about what we're looking for in introducing an audience to the joys and perils of importing a car after it's 25 years old, sight unseen from across an ocean, this was the perfect explanation of the blissful ownership that you could anticipate. And so I set off on a journey. My original plan had been to drive the car down to Tampa, where we were going to start on a car trek journey to the Amelia Island Concours and the Radwood show there. However, that became impossible. I was headed off on a Lux Rally event, and so I needed the car to kind of be gone through. I took it to one mechanic who immediately abandoned the idea, saying that he felt if he touched it, the rust was so significant that it would just fall apart. He said he couldn't align the car because everything was frozen in place, and he said that the cooling leaks throughout the aluminum coolant lines were so severe that he thought that they would just crumble if he even tried to remove them, clean them, do anything. And so he's like, you need to find somebody to make new ones. That didn't sound like an American craftsman's expertise that I was going to locate in about 4 days. But I did find someone at 380 Industries, the guys that prepped the Cayenne for Car Trek 6, they said they could weld them up. And so it went there, came back running, not leaking, but running maybe even a little bit worse. And so the car was only happy in a very narrow percentage of that 18 inches of throttle travel, which resulted in a slight increase in speed. So other than that, it was misfiring, backfiring, popping flames, just awful, just really, really bad. But it did move. And that was the most interesting thing, is that despite being so unhappy, the car just never seemed to stop. We get down there, they arrive in their cars, much less interesting ideas of the idea that you could import a car, and we set off on the journey. Now, fortunately, Sam and his team had removed this cowling cover that was necessary because in order to get into the hood, which you had to do constantly because the battery would die, you had to manually operate the release for the hood, which wouldn't have been available if the cover was in place. So we kept that off. Now, keep in mind that the windshield wipers worked intermittently, the headlights worked intermittently, the turn signals worked intermittently and would not cancel if you moved the stick in the other direction. And so the only way to turn them off was to turn. So if you wanted to use them as a non-BMW driver to change lanes, not available. Brake lights did not work. So it was not necessarily a road-worthy automobile in the form I found it. But it did, again, make for a very entertaining premise. Now, keep in mind, the car came with a folder of a dyno sheet with 350 horsepower, of $40,000 or so in maintenance over the prior few years. I mean, someone had begun really caring for the car about 3 years prior to Sam finding it. And we end up having the car. We're driving along. We take it to the track. The car is immediately and alarmingly slow. Now, the car was supposed to have a top speed of about 185 miles per hour, 360 horsepower from the factory to begin, obviously at the crank. That was not true. It would struggle mightily to do about 90 miles per hour. And our first stop is a racetrack, Cletus McFarland's Freedom Factory, where it is actually rubbing so badly that the track staff becomes uncomfortable with me driving it around in a circle because they think that the tires are going to explode, which was a real concern. So we just kind of wrote that into me getting black flagged. We actually did a little donut burnout thing on his little burnout pad, and I thought, oh man, I'm making so much amazing smoke. I looked back at the pictures of it. It was from the exhaust. It was not the tires, but it sounded like it was. The tires were making some noise, but it wasn't the smoke. You know, generally you're kind of in these car trek cars and you're like, I'm just falling in love with it throughout this journey. You know, seen in the 599 or the Gallardo Spider that you just sort of like figure out why the car is so awesome. That wasn't the reality of the TVR. It was how quickly can I not drive the car? And even more importantly, how quickly can someone else's name be on the title? We make it to the destination at Amelia Island just barely. And I'm pleased to not necessarily have to drive it again, but the next car trek, which was going to be filmed the next day, in fact, we were going to do 7 and 8, shot during the same about 8 or 9 day period, was to start from my house in Atlanta, which meant that I had to get it home. And at this point, we had no functionality of a 12-volt charging port, of headlights, taillights, turn signals, windshield wipers, heat, car things. The horn worked. And so I had to drive between 2 of our crew cars at night on the highway all the way home because no one else could see me and I couldn't see the road. Now I finally make it home in the car, and obviously objective next is get rid of it. And so I did need to get it to run a bit better because nobody was going to drive it away from my house in that way. And so I took it to Cameron Davis at DC Motorworks locally. He's worked on several of my cars, has a great Mercedes expertise, but also is willing to experiment with whatever. And that was really what was necessary here because nobody is trained in these things. So he gets in and just starts sending me these most ridiculous pictures of him pouring coolant out of the ECUs, of everything just stuck wherever it is. I mean, again, nothing on the car made any sense, all the way down to how you put fuel in the car. In order to get into the fuel tank, there's no fuel door or anything. It's in the trunk. And it took several different Googled YouTube videos and things to figure out that you have to gently and just so rightly caress the emblem on the rear that says Cerberus, jiggling it around in order for it to actuate some micro switch to get inside. Again, there's no real like door locks or anything, and so you have to press this button on the lower mirror to get it open, but you can't do that if the battery's dead, and the battery's always dead. At one point, the fuel pumps stopped not stopping, so you had to disconnect those in order to park the car overnight without it catching fire or spilling fuel everywhere. So I'd had such a great experience. I was really curious to see what he was going to find. And he just kept sending me different things. And he's like, hey, it ran a little well for 5 or 10 minutes today. And then it, did its thing. And over the course of about a month, he made the car work very, very well. He was so proud, in fact, that he kept telling me, Ed, you got to come drive this thing. And I was like, can we just leave it working and I not look at it, touch it, or be around it, and we'll just let somebody have it at that point? And so that's what happened. We I ended up meeting the guy who agreed to buy it as I listed it for sale on Auto Tempest through Facebook Marketplace. And I just said, hey, look, this is what it is. I described it in absolute honest detail. I said, all of it works sometimes, and it's very special and very significant. And so I listed for $59,000. At that point, I guess I was like 17,500 pounds to buy it, call it 25 grand in, 13 to ship it, a few grand beforehand, and then another, I don't know, 5 or so after the fact. So I'm probably $45,000 into this car. I made money on the most unreliable car trek car that we've had, and that includes a Maserati Quattroporte. So hey, how about that? The TVR ended up being a very, very satisfying ownership experience. It went on down the road and it became somebody else's X Max Power TVR. We'd like to thank Glossit for supporting the VINwiki channel this month. And right now, Glossit is offering the best DIY ceramic coating package that we've ever seen or certainly offered here on VINwiki. For just $69.99, you're going to get their graphene ceramic coating along with the Real Difference Maker, their ceramic detail spray. Now that's a $50 bottle of spray detailer that I truly love just for daily use. But when you use that alongside their graphene ceramic coating, it makes the removal a lot easier, the outcome a lot smoother, you avoid high spots and things like that. So a DIY idiot like me in my own garage can achieve an outcome pretty similar to what Rich and his team were able to do last year on the Paris Hilton SLR, which I eventually torture tested on rallies and road trips and all this stuff, and it is now in Bulgaria, still looking wonderful. So check it out now at the link in the description below. There's a very limited quantity, so respond now and get yours for just $69.99. Thanks, Glossit.